All right, everyone, it is 12:33. Welcome to our second webinar in a series around how schools and businesses can drive sustainability, and especially to adhere to the Department for Education's Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy. So we're glad to see you all here, and we're all looking forward to what questions are and your thoughts are. So we'll be kicking off as we're running quite a tight schedule as usual to adhere to the lunch hour and to the lunch and learn session style. So this webinar will be on how schools and suppliers especially can start to protect and promote the environment and circular economy. So a little bit about myself before we properly start. So my name is Ewan Chan. My background is primarily within the human rights due diligence and supply chain space, especially around counter slavery, trafficking in businesses globally. However, now I've moved into general sustainability strategy, including net zero. So I've provided quite a lot of practical solutions to hospitality, manufacturing, the tech industries, education institutions, and financial sectors across Asia Pacific, Europe, and the UK. And at the moment, I currently lead the Sustainable Schools Service, Sustainability Benchmarking, and Human Rights Services at ValleyMatch. So that's a little bit about myself and my background for talking about this topic. So for those that weren't here last week, we covered the topics of why sustainability is important to schools and SMEs. We also covered what the DfE strategy is at a high level, and we also covered what first steps schools and suppliers need to be doing to start adhering to the DfE strategy. So for those who weren't here last week, I'll go through some of the main points from the previous session as a whistle-stop tour, especially just to give you some context and some background behind what we're talking about today as well. So the first point from last week that we covered is that, in our view and in the views of many others, schools are what we'd call a critical junction, which means that different priorities of different areas converge when it comes to schools. So the first area where there's a critical junction is that schools are places where the goals and people of different community groups converge, so such as the community's workforce, local government, parents, and certainly children, who are the future of those communities, all come together to one social point. The second area where schools are a critical junction is that they tend to own large amounts of land, with one report saying that this amount of surplus land is about the size of central London or two Birminghams. This amount of land could be used to improve community welfare, environmental and climate resilience. And finally, schools are where the future generation is equipped with the skills and values needed to become leaders of the future. So while schools do have wide-reaching impacts regarding communities and the environment, arguably, children are the largest impact as they'll take on the mantle of taking care of our world when we're gone. So that's the critical junction, three main points. The second point is that schools are on the front line of major environmental and well-being issues. Especially since the pandemic period, where students are now returning to school and socializing, developing their skills in that area. And in addition, many schools are actually at risk of flooding by 2050. So schools represent a front line for major environmental issues and well-being issues as well, with climate change-induced symptoms of mental health issues like anxiety showing up in a lot of young people in the UK. And finally, the point around SMEs being important is that because of their role as specialists able to provide a bespoke service, they're actually really important to the private sector. And additionally, they tend to keep money within local areas and help communities develop economically and socially. And so SMEs are super important on many different levels, including sustainability as well. What we also covered last week is the DfE strategy at a high level. And so while there are 5 broad areas of focus in the strategy, the first 4 areas are really of highest focus immediately for schools and suppliers. This is such as things like driving climate education, developing green skills and careers, decarbonizing existing and new infrastructure with reportable outcomes, and on top of that, driving decarbonization through supply chains and internal operations. So some of the most immediate duties for schools in the next few years are to have sustainability leads and climate action plans in place by 2025, beginning to reduce the use of single-use products and minimizing waste, and beginning to procure food from lower carbon sources and local sources. The 5th area on screen to the right, international, is mainly around the UK using lessons learned from local schools and setting level data to share best practice with other countries. So that's how schools contribute to the international effort. but international is more of a UK government and foreign policy focused initiative than it is for local schools. So once again, as said before, the DfE document is a hefty piece of policy, but it can broadly be understood and actioned in a stair-step approach, where schools first have to develop a culture and leadership structure that prioritizes sustainability, lives out those values in all procurements, operations, and infrastructure, and uses all of these to build capacity of young people to contribute to the green industrial revolution. So while this applies currently to climate change, we also know that sustainability issues are deeply interconnected, meaning that broader areas like human rights and social value do need to be factored in within a school's sustainability strategy, so not just environment. So what exactly does, so going more into detail for this particular session around environmental protection and circular economy promotion, what exactly does the DfE strategy require broadly around actions regarding those themes? So on screen, these are some of the main actions that the strategy looks at for schools and the private sector to adhere to in their operations and governance. So these are areas like on screen related to climate education, providing capacity building to staff for teaching around climate education and providing education opportunities to students through things like healthy eating, sustainable living, retrofitting projects for the schools, and participation in the National Education Nature Park. For green skills and careers, it's really providing skills development for students, such as through T levels and careers guidance. And on top of that, it's aligning apprenticeships to net zero objectives. For education, estate, and infrastructure, it'll be things like utilizing smart meters in schools to facilitate setting level data being used for strategy setting for the DfE. And on top of that, reporting will be mandatory if voluntary efforts are insufficient around food and emissions reporting. And finally, for operations and supply chains, all schools have to have sustainability leads and climate action plans, or CAPs, by 2025, as said before and said now. Schools also have to begin procuring from suppliers committed to net zero by 2050 and evaluated for their sustainability. Schools should also start sourcing food locally and reporting on progress in this area, as well as reducing single-use plastics and promoting circular economy. Now, that's quite a lot, but before I go into the next section, one of my favorite quotes is from the film Oppenheimer, and it goes, "The important thing isn't can you read music, it's can you hear it? Can you hear the music?" So the quote, the meaning to me is that it begs you to look not just at the notes on the page or the words themselves, but it really asks you to look deeper and understand the trajectory of an idea and the spirit behind what's written. So with that in mind, when it comes to sustainability regulations and guidance, we need to really be able to discern the spirit of legislation in order to stay ahead and on top of it. So if we look at the different action items that the DfE gives, what do you think is the central theme or function that ties all of these together? Please let me know what your ideas are in the chat in terms of what those ideas are. All right, I'll give a few more seconds before I crack out the answer if someone wants to pitch in to give what the central theme is. Yeah, working collaboratively. That's a good one. That's a very good one. You have to have a joined up approach. Absolutely. So certainly, all right, hold on, I'm just taking a look in the chat. So certainly working collaboratively is part of it, but the main central theme that I believe ties this all together is actually procurement. So, but more importantly, procurement that's done effectively and with a targeted goal in mind. Procurement done properly and with a goal in mind is actually what's going to enable provision of healthy meals, enable effective retrofits, skills development for students, acquisition of smart meters, sourcing from sustainable suppliers, and reduction in single-use products. Well-run and planned procurements enable sound strategies and smooth operations that are resourced appropriately. But what are the kinds of steps that lead to the kind of procurement we want that drives impact? So the steps we outlined last week still remain absolutely critical, and I'll go through them again. So the joint first steps that trusts or individual settings should be doing is to establish a climate action plan and establish sustainability leadership in their school. So a climate action plan should cover 4 broad areas according to the DfE guidance. So it should cover how your trust will work towards net zero and towards decarbonizing. This should also involve baselining your carbon emissions first to have a measurable point to work from. It should also cover adaptation and resilience, so how your trust will aim to enhance the estate and work to adapt it for climate resilience, such as towards flooding and overheating. It should also look at how your trust will promote biodiversity. And finally, how your trust will promote climate education in schools and enhance green careers opportunities for staff and students. The joint other item on this list is to establish sustainability leadership in your school setting across either the setting level, trust level, or both. This can be a person or it can be a team that's in charge of delivering the sustainability agenda. So ideally, it should be made up of a diverse team of individuals, and it should cover team members that span across multiple operational and teaching departments. And ultimately, senior leadership should be involved as they can provide the decision making and authority and capacity to drive trust and setting-wide change. So just to let you know, these 2 things are actually mandatory by 2025. So this isn't a recommendation. This is a compliance matter. So please keep that in mind. So moving on to the next bit, identifying social value outcomes. So with a leadership team in place for sustainability, it's important to factor in what things you want to enshrine within your climate action plan and what goals you want to enshrine. So there's many things you could do, but it can be quite hard to put into words what priorities you have. We really recommend using the UK government social value model themes, as it provides quite a structured way of breaking down different impact areas to inspire your trust's choice of goals. And this also still helps you contribute to the DfE strategy because climate change is part of those goals. The different themes are things like helping communities recover from COVID in an economic and a well-being sense. It also includes tackling economic inequality. It includes fighting climate change and protecting the environment. It promotes equal opportunities, which includes fighting modern slavery and labor exploitation. And finally, it also promotes well-being in the workforce and in communities. Those are the social value model themes. So enshrining certain goals and impact into your strategy and your climate action plan will really help with targeting procurements to drive outcomes. So here are some examples. Do you want your procurement to create careers development opportunities through the suppliers and for students? Could your suppliers be contracted to contribute to biodiversity initiatives on your estates as part of the service delivery? Could you also be helping to minimize inequality issues within your student and staff body through effective procurement criteria? So having clear goals and metrics to benchmark supplier performance also really helps with comparing like-for-like proposals from different suppliers around the outcomes you want to see. So, we're talking about this all the time. What have we actually done? Because procurement can be used as a lever for impact, it's important for outcomes to be contracted in and evaluated for. So in this case study, we actually helped a multi-academy trust procure uniforms, and this is an area that parents can actually feel costs can sometimes be quite unreasonable, and it can also disproportionately affect lower income families because of that, and this can be a result of hastily and non-compliantly done procurements. So through this procurement, we actually managed to achieve the following impact on screen. So 70% of the total product range utilized recycled fabric, and this achieves a reduced environmental footprint. And this is particularly important because the garments industry is actually responsible for around 10% of global carbon emissions, and up to 92 million tons of clothing ends up in landfill. So this is what we're trying to combat. We also managed to introduce a installment paying scheme, which made it easier financially for parents and guardians to manage paying for uniforms. We also got the supplier to commit to providing careers support, such as partly funded apprenticeships for students, as well as 4 to 5 week internships for students as well. And we also managed to implement a second-hand uniform platform solution, which enables circular use of uniforms and increases the cost savings for parents and guardians in the process. So another case study was from last week, which we still feel is very relevant for this presentation. So we helped to do a reprocurement for catering services as a vehicle for positive outcomes. So through this, we managed to get the following outcomes and impacts on screen. We managed to get 29% savings over a 5-year period for the whole menu. We managed to get 8 to 10% worth of savings through green training for staff around kitchen efficiency. We also managed to create 2 apprenticeship opportunities for pupils and students annually through collaborating with the supplier, which contributes to career opportunities for students. And finally, we also managed to set goals to achieve a minimum of the Bronze Soil Association accreditation during the contract period, which contributes to fighting climate change. So looking at this, we've covered practical steps for schools for promoting environmental protection and circular economy. What are the things that suppliers can do? Once again, the steps from last week are still very relevant. We haven't changed them, but we'll add a little bit more detail around it. So once again, one of the DfE's goals is to encourage schools to procure from suppliers committed to net zero. And so suppliers have to be committed to net zeros themselves to contribute to this, right? So our top recommendation is for suppliers, especially SMEs, to develop a carbon reduction plan and annually review it and update it. So we personally recommend that suppliers follow the PPN 0621 standard for carbon reduction plans, as it means that the plan will adhere to standards, in the wider public sector procurement space as well. One thing to note is the importance of scope 3 within your plan, because around 70% of emissions will come from scope 3. So things like, your supply chains, waste generated, business travel, employee commuting, and downstream transport and distribution. So another recommendation that's quite important that we feel is suppliers to conduct sustainability benchmarking. So this looks at your business's overall performance to identify where strengths and weaknesses are when it comes to sustainability, where the quick wins can be made, and what recommendations for moving forward there are. So additionally, when it comes to responding to public sector tenders, you may actually often be asked what initiatives you're currently or planning to take to address different sustainability and social value areas. So conducting a benchmarking of your sustainability and of your carbon footprint to develop recommendations can really help provide the direction and information for a appropriate response that tenders are looking for to show that you're on the right trajectory. So within the public sector, these kinds of requirements are actually becoming more and more common. And in order to combat the climate crisis, they will have to become tighter and tighter. There's no other way. And businesses that fail to adapt in time will be left behind. So really pay close attention to this. So as said before, when it comes to carbon reduction planning, Value Match does do a carbon reduction planning service for SMEs. We can also do carbon baselining for schools as well as a form of support. So we do this according to the PPN 0621 standard to adhere to general public sector best practice. We also have a free carbon footprint calculation tool that you can use for helping to establish your baseline. On top of that, one of the things I did, I went on a cycling trip this weekend, and I used this tool to very roughly calculate my carbon footprint with that trip. So, with good recording of your receipts, your travel, and your waste generation, this is an incredibly straightforward tool to use to establish your baseline. And on the note of sustainability benchmarking, whether your organization needs it with just one area of sustainability, or you need to understand your sustainability overall across different areas, this is a really great tool to use that we've used with SMEs and large international businesses alike. We perform quite a detailed assessment across 6 category areas, with 4 levels of maturity aligned to the UN Sustainability Development Goals, the UK Government Social Value Model, as well as English, Welsh, and relevant Scottish regulations. So the 6 areas are environmental management, human rights and labor standards, equality, diversity, inclusion, resource use and circular economy, social value delivery, and health and well-being. So it looks at all these different areas that are fairly interconnected with each other. So another area we work in is the Sustainable Schools Assessment, which is benchmarking for schools specifically to help them comply with the DfE strategy. So our goal really is to help schools become places that steward environment. So as youth develop a sense of agency to protect their environment, schools should be working to provide future generations with an environment worth protecting. On top of that, we also help schools to work towards strengthening communities. So, strong communities are core to sustainable prosperity and resilience. Schools need to ensure that their activities contribute positively to the future of not just the students, but the wider community. And finally, our goal is also to help schools move towards safeguarding people better, because strong communities are made up of healthy and strong individuals, and schools must have an ability to protect not only those inside of them, but those outside of them. So sustainable schools as a model works in 3 different stages. It's an approach of lining up our sustainability consulting services with our sustainable procurement services into an approach that can be replicated across different multi-academy trusts or single academy trusts in schools. We mainly look at the operations and policies to analyze for gaps and strengths. And finally, the output of this Sustainable Schools Assessment Report outlines the analysis, the findings, and the recommendations from which we'll collaborate with your trust to create an action plan for you to implement. So once again, while climate change can be quite doom and gloom, there's actually a lot of benefits that come with sustainable impact for schools, such as further decarbonizing infrastructure, procurement that works towards net zero, increasing social value generation through careers development and development of communities, and it really results in stronger environmental governance and can also help with your reputation as a school for when new attendees want to join. So on screen, I have a list of different services that we do that addresses different DfE action areas, such as carbon calculations, ethical dynamic purchasing systems, and procurement efficiency, helping to contract for young people, development opportunities, and sustainable school assessments. You can see them all on screen. We'll be sending these slides to you after the session so you can take a look at it more in detail. So we are coming to the close of the webinar and coming towards the questions and answers session. Just wanted to flag that in a couple weeks' time on Wednesday, on July 17th at 12:30 to 1:15, the same time, we'll be looking specifically at modern slavery and how it relates to schools and their suppliers. So defining modern slavery and where it shows up, how it impacts schools and their suppliers, what Value Match have found effective as an SME when it comes to working around modern slavery mitigation, and also what we think are the important first steps that schools and suppliers can take to combating modern slavery and human rights risks. So without anything else for this webinar, we're jumping into the question and answer session. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar. Really excited to hear your questions and looking forward to discussing. So the questions and answers floor is open. Feel free to ask us questions and we'll answer to the best of our ability.
Hi, Ewan. We have a couple of questions.
All right.
The first question is, what are some examples of measurable sustainability outcomes we could propose in procurement tenders?
That's a good question. I think being quite targeted about what kind of outcomes and metrics you have is really important because you can compare like for like when it comes to procurements. So certain examples you could factor in as KPIs for suppliers could be like, say, annual percentage reduction for carbon emissions within the service. It could be how many apprenticeships provided per year as part of the contract, those kinds of things. Be quite specific. Laura, was there anything you want? Laura or Dan, was there anything you wanted to add around this?
No, nothing in particular. I think you've covered the main areas. I think it's just about, as I say, it's hard. I think. Sorry, you can't see me. Just realised. I think it's hard in. Sorry, I lost train of thought. It's hard in tenders. I think to kind of. It's easy to talk about sustainability and the outcomes, but I think it's the measuring. So I think the more you can kind of define what your sustainability outcome is and what you want to try to achieve and how you want to try to measure it as well and tie it all together is better in a tender to receive, because then you can sort of kind of see the whole process. Whereas if people just talk about kind of sustainability outcomes and things they want to achieve, but there's kind of no meat on the bones or no examples of how they might want to think about measuring it, it's harder then to kind of get your head around kind of the whole process of kind of how they're going to drive that sustainability outcome and really embed it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Laura.
No worries.
Another one, please, Ewan.
Yep.
What are some effective ways of finding sustainable suppliers?
Ooh. I think some effective ways for finding sustainable suppliers, I think once again, is being very clear about what criteria for sustainability you have for your procurement so that you can see how suppliers respond, and to see whether they actually have a strategy to meet that, which tells you how sustainable they are as a supplier. On top of that, going through sustainable frameworks is something that the DfE mentions that they want to support schools to get onto. Laura, you might have some more information around things like the Heart DPS that we run.
Yeah, so I think a couple of points. I think suppliers generally are becoming more aware of the fact that they need to be more sustainable. So they are, kind of gearing themselves up, and hopefully we're seeing a trend where suppliers are getting more ready to meet kind of the sustainable requirements that are coming out in tenders across the board. So that's one thing. I think the other side is as Ewan's talked about, kind of, evaluation criteria in all our tenders for our DPSs, we've got quite a lot of ethical and sustainable questions. So suppliers need to be able to meet those or comply with those to kind of, offer services via those DPSs. One of the DPSs we run is a Heart DPS, so that effectively has those kind of questions and kind of challenges in it. So to be able to get on that framework, you need to be able to kind of meet some minimum criteria. And then the tenders that are kind of run within our DPSs, again, are very kind of committed and linked to with our partner organisations that we do them with, around kind of sustainability kind of targets, being able to evidence it and being able to kind of implement that through the contract that they then win through that procurement process. But yeah, if anybody really wants any more detail on our DPSs, how we run them, what they're about, then happy to kind of share that information. In relation to our Heart DPS, suppliers that come onto that for kind of a really small monthly fee, they get access to a lot of kind of intel that we can support them with in terms of me and my team around bidding capability, supply capability assessment. There's access to training around things like incorporating social value in tenders and things like that. So there's a lot of information that we can share, and that we really want to work with our suppliers to kind of improve their, I guess, the level of information and their awareness of kind of sustainability as a broad area throughout the procurement process.
Great. Thanks very much, Laura.
It might just be worth pointing out we'll share all the relevant links and contact details in the follow-up email as we've done last week. Ewan, there's another question. How do I identify what strengths and goals my trust should focus on? What's the process?
Interesting. I think it really depends on a case-by-case basis. I mean, that's one reason we've developed the sustainable schools assessment process. It helps to look at what your policies and procedures are, and also what your school's likely environmental and human rights impacts are. So, this is highly dependent on what the income of the school is, how many sites you have, what your emissions baseline is. So, how much energy you're using, how much water you use, and looking at these different areas, we can analyze where your impacts are, where interventions need to be made, and how they can potentially be made. And we also look at procurement effectiveness as well through commercial discovery service, which is something we do, which looks at how compliant your procurement is, how efficient your spending is, and that's also another area that we can help to identify what goals to focus on and where impact can be made. So I hope that answers the question.
Oh, thank you, Ewan. I think we have one more.
Sure.
If the Department for Education strategy is focused on environmental impact, why should I include social value themes?
That's a very good question. I think yes, that's correct. While at first glance, the Department for Education strategy is focused on climate change, if you read the fine print of the strategy, as well as the sort of fine print of the social value model, there's a lot of overlap between the two. If the Department for Education, or DfE, is wanting you to provide education opportunities to students through retrofitting projects, as well as career opportunities, that actually tackles job creation themes within the social value model, and it also tackles fighting the climate change theme. So they really do interconnect. And additionally, if the DfE is wanting you to procure from sustainable suppliers, naturally that also means that you're having to have suppliers that adhere to environmental best practice as well as human rights best practice. And so things like combating modern slavery in your supply chains is also going to be really important to the DfE strategy. It also ties in with the theme of the just transition. We don't want to move towards net zero at the expense of people. Otherwise, we end up achieving one very good goal, but to the detriment of other people. So I think that's why it's really important to factor in social value overall.
Thank you, Ewan.
Thanks for the reaction, Nadine. Any other questions before we close out?
I think that's all the questions I can find.
Nadine is typing. I'm just wondering if she's typing a question. So I was just going to say maybe just hang fire. No, she's just saying she's got to head off, but she appreciates the work.
All right, no problem.
Sorry,
thanks very much, Nadine.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Thanks, Nadine.
Without further ado,
I think that's it. Thanks.
I'd probably say we can finish ahead of schedule and let people have the rest of their lunches. But thank you to everyone who's come so far, and looking forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks' time.